Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The bar was loud, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, the occasional shout as someone celebrated a win at the dartboard. It was the kind of place you went to unwind, not to draw attention. That's exactly why I chose it. But then came them. Three guys I barely knew, but wished I didn't know at all. Let's call them Adam, Mike, and Josh. Your typical loudmouths who think they're funnier and smarter than everyone else in the room. We were all connected through mutual friends, which is probably why they felt so comfortable sliding into my booth without an invitation. Man, haven't seen you in a while, Adam said, clapping me on the back like we were best friends. How's life treating you? Still, between jobs? His smirk was impossible to miss. I smiled politely. Yeah, something like that. Something like that? Sounds like code for unemployed. Am I right, guys? He turned to Mike and Josh, who laughed like they'd never heard anything funnier. Hey, don't be too hard on him, Mike chimed in. Times are tough. Not everyone's cut out for the grind, right? I could feel the weight of their words, the way they seemed to grow louder with each jab. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone. Condescending, smug, like they were performing for an audience that wasn't even paying attention. What's it been now? 6 months? A year? Josh added, leaning back in his chair as if he were the CEO of the universe. A year and a half, I said calmly, taking a sip of my drink. That was a lie, of course. I hadn't been unemployed in years. But why correct them? Let them think what they wanted. I had no interest in explaining myself to people who had already decided I was beneath them. You should have said something, man, Adam said, grinning like he'd just had a brilliant idea. We could have hooked you up. Mike's company is hiring for. What is it, entry-level sales? That's right up your alley. Another round of laughter. Yeah, dude, Mike added. I mean, it's not glamorous, but it's honest work. Beats sitting on your ass all day, right? At this point, the bartender was glancing over, clearly sensing the shift in tone. A few people at the bar were starting to notice too. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. But I didn't give them a show. Thanks for the offer, I said, my voice steady. I'll keep it in mind. The calmness seemed to throw them off, but only for a second. You're a good sport. I'll give you that, Josh said, raising his beer like he was toasting my ability to endure their nonsense. Most people would have walked out by now. But hey, maybe you can't afford to. That one stung. Not because it was true, but because it wasn't. I wasn't sitting there because I had no other options. I was sitting there because I wanted to see how far they'd take this. They had no idea who they were talking to. You see, I own a business. A pretty successful one, too. I started it 5 years ago, pouring every ounce of energy, every dollar I had into making it work. It wasn't easy, but it paid off. These days, I don't have to answer to anyone. If I want to take a week or a month off, I do. I built a life on my own terms, and I'm proud of that. But these guys, they weren't just clueless. They were cocky, overconfident in their ignorance. And here's the kicker. I didn't realize it at the time, but all three of them worked for my company. Anyway, Adam said, standing up and clapping me on the shoulder again. It was good seeing you, man. If you need any tips on, getting back in the game, give me a call. We got to help each other out, right? Right, I said, forcing a small smile. As they walked away, laughing and high-fiving like they just scored the winning touchdown, I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle in. What would you have done? Stood up and told them off? Pulled out some business card with a flashy title to shut them up? I thought about it. I really did. But then I realized something. Let them think they've won. Let them believe their version of reality for a little while longer. Because in the real world, the tables always turn. And when they do, oh, it's going to be one hell of a show. It was a couple of days later, and I was back at work. My office wasn't anything too flashy. Simple, modern, but with a view of the city that reminded me of how far I'd come. I like to keep things understated. The work spoke for itself. That morning, I had a stack of reports to review. Team performance metrics, quarterly sales figures, the usual. It was routine until I noticed something that made me stop mid-sip of my coffee. There, on the employee roster for one of our regional divisions, were 3 very familiar names, Adam, Mike, and Josh. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. It was them. Adam was a regional sales manager. Mike worked under him as a team lead. And Josh, he was an entry-level guy, just like the role they'd so generously offered to hook me up with. I leaned back in my chair, letting the irony sink in. These guys, who had spent an entire evening mocking me for being unemployed, were collecting paychecks from my company. The same company I'd built from the ground up. At first, I laughed. I mean, you couldn't write a story this perfect. But then the laughter faded, and something else settled in its place. Anger. Who did they think they were? Sitting there, looking down on me, acting like they were better than me, when in reality, I was the one signing their checks. They didn't know, of course, but that didn't make it sting any less. I stared at their names for a long time, replaying their words in my head. Between jobs, sitting on your ass all day, can't even afford coffee. It wasn't just the insults. It was the arrogance behind them, the assumption that they could talk to someone like that and get away with it. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go. They didn't know who I was, and it wasn't like I could blame them for not recognizing me as their employer. I was hands-off when it came to day-to-day operations. They'd probably never seen my face in the company newsletter or our quarterly all-hands meetings. But then another thought crept in. What kind of people treat anyone like that? Whether I was their boss, a stranger, or just some guy in a bar, their behavior said more about them than it did about me. That's when I made my decision. I called my assistant, Lisa, into the office. Can you get me the HR reports for the West Division? I want to take a closer look at their performance metrics. She raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Sure thing. Anything specific you're looking for? Just a routine review, I said, keeping my voice neutral. As soon as the reports landed on my desk, I dove in. I wasn't looking for excuses. I didn't need them, but I wanted to make sure I was being fair. I wasn't about to act impulsively. If I was going to do something, it needed to be justified. Adam's metrics were okay. Not great, not terrible. His team's numbers were consistently underperforming compared to other regions. Mike's were worse. And Josh, well, he was new, but his track record so far didn't exactly scream future leader. Still, numbers weren't the only thing that mattered. I'd built this company on a foundation of respect. Respect for the work, for the people, and for the values we upheld. If my employees couldn't embody that, they didn't belong here. The question was, how far was I willing to take this? I sat there, staring at their names, weighing my options. Was this about justice or revenge? Did I want to teach them a lesson? Or was I just nursing a bruised ego? Maybe it was both. By the end of the day, I'd made up my mind. I wouldn't fire them on the spot. That wasn't my style. But I wasn't going to let this slide, either. They needed to understand that actions have consequences, even when they think no one's watching. The first step was to involve HR. I drafted an email outlining my concerns about their conduct, both their performance and their behavior outside of work. I didn't mention the bar incident, of course. This wasn't about settling personal scores. It was about setting a standard. As I hit send, I felt a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction, anticipation, and a flicker of doubt. What would you have done in my position? Would you have let it go, or would you have taken action? I didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: Adam, Mike, and Josh were about to find out just how small the world can be. The HR process took a few days to set in motion. I didn't want this to feel rushed or reactionary. It had to be methodical, professional. If they were going to face consequences, it would be on my terms, not theirs. By the time the scheduled meetings came around, I'd gone over everything a dozen times. Their performance reviews, attendance records, even the feedback from their direct reports. Adam, Mike, and Josh weren't just mediocre employees. They were actively dragging down the culture I'd worked so hard to build. Still, I wasn't prepared for how satisfying it would feel to hear their voices the moment my assistant connected the calls. Adam, I said, keeping my tone even but firm. This is Mr. Carter. Do you have a moment to talk? The silence on the other end lasted a little too long. Sure, Mr. Carter, he finally said. His voice was cautious, unsure. He wasn't used to hearing from someone in my position. I've been reviewing the performance of our regional teams, I continued, and I noticed some concerning trends in your division. Specifically, your team's numbers have been consistently below target for the last 3 quarters. Can you explain why that is? There was a faint rustling sound, like he was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Well, the market's been tough, and my team's doing their best. Is that so? I replied, my tone cool, because I've spoken with HR, and it seems there have been some issues with morale in your office as well. Complaints about your leadership style. What complaints? His voice sharpened, a mix of defensiveness and panic. I'd rather not go into specifics over the phone, I said, keeping my voice neutral. But the bottom line is this. As a manager, you set the tone for your team. If they're not performing, it starts with you. And right now, your numbers and the feedback I've received suggest you're not meeting the standard we expect. Wait, Mr. Carter, I can fix this, he stammered. Just give me a chance to... This isn't a decision I've made lightly, I interrupted. But we need to make changes for the good of the company. HR will reach out to you with next steps. The call ended before he could respond. I sat back, letting the silence settle around me. Next up was Mike. "Mr. Carter? Is something wrong?" he asked as soon as the call connected. "Mike, I'll get straight to the point. Your team's output has been consistently below expectations, and there have been concerns raised about your conduct outside of work." "My conduct? What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with nervous energy. "I think you know exactly what I mean," I said, letting the implication hang in the air. He didn't respond, but I could almost hear his mind racing. "Effective immediately. We're parting ways," I said. "HR will provide you with all the details. But it's not up for discussion, Mike. Good luck." The third call, to Josh, was quicker. He was the least experienced, the most junior, and to his credit, he didn't try to argue. He just muttered a weak, "okay," and hung up after I delivered the news. When it was all over, I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. I'd done what I came here to do. I'd set a standard and held them accountable. So why didn't I feel better? The fallout started almost immediately. By the next morning, word had spread. People were talking about the firings, the reasons behind them, and the sudden shift in tone coming from upper management. Some people thought it was overdue. Others thought I'd been too harsh. Then came the messages. Adam emailed first. A long-winded, desperate apology that danced around the specifics, but begged for a second chance. He claimed he hadn't realized how bad things had gotten, that he could change if given the opportunity. Mike's was shorter, but angrier. He accused me of not giving him a fair shot, of punishing him for things beyond his control. Josh didn't reach out at all. But here's the thing. None of them mentioned the bar. None of them seemed to realize that the unemployed loser they'd mocked was the same person responsible for their sudden career derailments. For now, I kept that detail to myself. What would you have done? Would you have told them the truth? Shown your hand and let them squirm under the weight of their own arrogance? Or would you have stayed quiet, letting them wonder where it all went wrong? I thought firing them would feel like justice. And in some ways it did, but it also felt hollow, like I'd won the battle but lost something in the process. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about them. It was about me, my pride, my need to prove something, to them, to myself, to the world. The question was, what was I proving? The thing about decisions like this is that they don't happen in a vacuum. You pull one string, and before you know it, the whole web starts unraveling. I thought firing Adam, Mike, and Josh would be the end of it, a clean break. But instead, it was just the beginning. It started with Adam. A week after the termination, I heard from HR that he'd filed a grievance. Not against the company, but against his former colleagues. Apparently, Adam claimed that his team had undermined his leadership, dragging down performance and making him look bad. When I read the details, I had to laugh. Adam was essentially blaming the very people he was supposed to lead. Not once did he take accountability for his failures, or even hint that he'd been at fault. But it wasn't just the grievance. Word got back to me that Adam's personal life was falling apart, too. He was going through a divorce, and without his paycheck, he was struggling to make alimony payments. His emails to HR became more frantic, each one begging for reconsideration, offering to take a pay cut, even suggesting he'd relocate if it meant keeping his job. Part of me felt for him. I'm not heartless. I knew what it was like to hit rock bottom. I'd been there myself once upon a time, but I also knew Adam wasn't entirely innocent. He was reaping what he'd sown, even if it was more than he'd bargained for. Mike's fallout was messy. A few days after his termination, I received a phone call from an angry client. Apparently, Mike had been bad-mouthing the company to anyone who'd listen. Clients, former coworkers, even mutual industry contacts. He was going out of his way to trash our reputation. I called our legal team immediately. They reminded me that Mike had signed a non-disparagement agreement when he joined the company. It wasn't long before he received a formal cease and desist letter. That should have been the end of it. But Mike didn't know how to quit. He took to social media, posting vague, passive-aggressive rants about toxic workplaces and cutthroat bosses who stab you in the back. He didn't mention the company by name, but everyone in our circle knew who he was talking about. I couldn't help but think back to that night in the bar, when Mike had laughed in my face and offered me an entry-level job. It felt poetic, in a way, to see him scramble now, clinging to his pride, even as his world fell apart. Josh was a different story altogether. Unlike Adam and Mike, he didn't try to fight back or lash out. He just disappeared. No emails, no phone calls, no posts online. Nothing. I thought about him sometimes, wondering what he was doing, if he'd found another job. He was young, inexperienced, a kid, really. Maybe I'd been too hard on him. Maybe I'd taken out my frustration on the wrong person. But then I remembered his smug grin in the bar, the way he'd piled on with the others, throwing in his cheap shots for the sake of a laugh. He wasn't innocent. None of them were. And then there was me. The thing about revenge, real calculated revenge, is that it doesn't feel the way you think it will. You imagine it'll be satisfying, cathartic, like flipping a switch and turning the tables in your favor. But in reality, it's messy, complicated. I'd won, sure. I'd taken control of the situation, asserted my power, and taught them a lesson they wouldn't forget. But at what cost? Every time I thought about Adam's divorce, or Mike's bitterness, or Josh's disappearance, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. I told myself they deserved it, that they'd brought this on themselves. And maybe they had. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd gone too far. One night, I was sitting in my office, staring out the window at the city lights, when Lisa knocked on the door. "Everything okay?" she asked, stepping inside. "Yeah," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. She studied me for a moment, then said, "I heard about what happened with Adam and the others." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you did the right thing. This company has standards, and they didn't meet them. That's on them, not you." I smiled faintly, but her words didn't sink in. After she left, I found myself replaying that night in the bar again. The way they'd laughed, the things they'd said, the anger I'd felt. And then I thought about what Lisa had said. This company has standards. Was that why I'd done it? To uphold some lofty principle about accountability and respect? Or had it been personal? What would you have done? Would you have let them off the hook, knowing they'd never face the consequences of their actions? Or would you have done what I did, drawn the line, and made an example of them? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the dominoes were still falling, and I wasn't sure how many more were left to tip. It was bound to happen eventually. The truth always has a way of coming out, no matter how carefully you try to keep it hidden. I wasn't exactly trying to keep secrets. It just didn't seem necessary to spell everything out. But when Adam, Mike, and Josh finally connected the dots, I wasn't surprised. I was, however, caught off guard by how it all went down. It was a Friday evening, and I just wrapped up a late meeting when my assistant buzzed through. "There's someone here to see you," Lisa said cautiously. "Actually, 3 people. I already knew who it was." "Send them in," I said, leaning back in my chair. The door opened, and there they were, Adam, Mike, and Josh, looking like a trio of nervous schoolboys called into the principal's office. Gone were the smug grins and cocky attitudes. Instead, there was tension in their shoulders, and their eyes darted around the room as if they were afraid to make direct eye contact. "Mr. Carter," Adam started, his voice hesitant. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the chairs across from my desk. They shuffled in awkwardly, glancing at each other like they were deciding who would speak first. "Let me guess," I said, breaking the silence. "You're here because you finally figured out who I am?" Adam shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mike cleared his throat. Josh just stared at the floor. "We didn't know," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't know what?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air. "That you're the owner," Mike blurted out. "We had no idea you were that night at the bar." I nodded slowly, letting their discomfort build. "You didn't know," I repeated. "And that makes it okay? The way you talked to me? The things you said?" "No," Adam said quickly. "No, it doesn't. We were out of line. All of us." Josh finally looked up. "We were just joking around. We didn't mean anything by it." I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't mean anything by it? You called me a loser. You laughed in my face. You mocked me in front of a room full of strangers. That didn't mean anything to you." Josh's face turned bright red, and he looked back down at the floor. There was a long pause. Then Adam spoke up again. "Look, Mr. Carter, we were wrong. All of us. And we're sorry. If we'd known who you were—" "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "Don't finish that sentence. Because what you're about to say, it's exactly the problem." They stared at me confused. "If you'd known who I was, you would have treated me differently," I said. "You would have respected me, maybe even sucked up to me. But because you thought I was just some guy at a bar, you didn't think twice about tearing me down?" "That's not," Mike started, but I cut him off. "It is," I said firmly. "That's exactly what happened. And that's why you're here. Not because you're sorry for what you did, but because you're sorry for what it cost you." Silence. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Let me ask you something. If I hadn't fired you, if you were still working here, would you be sitting in this office right now apologizing to me?" They didn't answer. "That's what I thought," I said, sitting back. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air in the room was heavy, thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Adam broke the silence. "Is there any chance at all, that we can come back? We've learned our lesson. We'll do better." I swear. I looked at him, then at Mike and Josh. Their faces were a mix of desperation and shame. Here's the thing, I said after a long pause. It's not about the lesson you've learned. It's about the kind of people you are. And I can't have people like you representing my company. Adam's shoulders sagged. Mike shook his head in disbelief. Josh just sat there, looking like he might cry. You said you didn't mean anything by it, I continued, my voice steady. But words matter. How you treat people matters. And if you can't figure that out on your own, I can't teach it to you. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Good luck to you. I hope you find what you're looking for. One by one, they stood and shuffled toward the door. Adam was the last to leave, turning back to look at me one more time. We really are sorry, he said quietly. I nodded but didn't say anything. When the door closed behind him, I let out a long breath. What would you have done? Would you have given them a second chance? Or would you have done what I did? Held them accountable, even if it meant shutting the door for good? I wanted to believe I'd done the right thing. But as I sat there alone in my office, staring at the empty chairs across from me, I couldn't help but wonder if the real lesson wasn't for them, but for me. The weekend came, but the weight of the past few weeks stayed with me. I couldn't stop replaying the moments in my head. Adam's desperate apology, Mike's anger, Josh's silence. Each one lingered like an unresolved chord, refusing to fade. I should have felt victorious. I had the upper hand from the start, and I used it. I'd drawn a line in the sand and sent a clear message. Respect matters. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was empty. That Saturday, I found myself walking through the city, hoping to clear my head. The streets were alive with the usual weekend buzz. Couples holding hands, kids chasing each other, street performers trying to earn a few dollars. I passed a small cafe and stopped at the window, watching as a young barista carefully poured a latte. It reminded me of when I was younger, scraping by on minimum wage while chasing a dream no one else believed in. Back then, I dealt with my fair share of condescension. Managers who didn't see my potential, customers who treated me like I didn't matter. That was why I started my company in the first place. I wanted to create something different, a place where people were valued for who they were, not just what they could produce. Had I lost sight of that? When I got home, I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at the city lights through my living room window. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Lisa. Lisa, just checking in. Hope you're okay. You did the right thing. I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the keyboard. Eventually, I typed back. Me thanks. I hope so. I didn't hit send. Instead, I put the phone down and let the silence fill the room. By Monday morning, I convinced myself to move on. The decisions were made, the conversations had. It was time to focus on the future. But as I walked into the office, something caught my eye, a handwritten note sitting on my desk. It was folded neatly, no envelope, just my name scrawled across the top in uneven letters. I opened it and recognized Adam's handwriting immediately. Mr. Carter, I don't expect forgiveness. I know I've burned that bridge. But I want you to know that I've thought a lot about what you said, that how we treat people matters. You're right. I failed, and it cost me. But I'm going to do better. For myself, for my family, and for anyone who ever has to work with me again. Thank you for opening my eyes. Adam, asterisk, asterisk. I read the note twice, then set it down carefully. Later that day, I had a meeting with Lisa. As we reviewed the agenda, she noticed the notes sitting on the edge of my desk. From them, she asked. Just Adam, I said. She raised an eyebrow. What does it say? That he's going to do better, I replied. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. Do you believe him? I leaned back in my chair, considering her question. I think he means it, I said finally. But I don't know if it'll last. Lisa didn't respond right away. When she did, her words caught me off guard. Maybe that's not the point, she said. Maybe the point is that you gave him a reason to try. I didn't know what to say to that. That evening, I sat in my office long after everyone else had gone home. Adam's note was still on my desk, and I kept glancing at it, as though it held answers I couldn't find on my own. What would you have done? Would you have kept them on, given them a chance to redeem themselves? Or would you have done what I did, drawn the line and refused to look back? I don't know if there's a right answer. All I know is that I've learned something, too, about pride, about power, about the kind of person I want to be. And maybe that's enough.